Hi, I'm Pat Hilbert, coordinator of the Taylor X's Association and a proud Taylor Duck from the class of 1969. One of the highlights of homecoming each year is the induction of the Taylor High School graduate into the Duck Hall of Fame. Classes that graduate at least 20 years ago may nominate a member of their class who exemplifies the special qualities and achievements of humanitarian and community service, or who have achieved outstanding success in their professional fields. In this featured video from the Duck Hall of Fame series, Naomi Posman visits with 2016 inductee Julia Clattenhoff Mellenbruch. A graduate from the class of 1933, Mrs. Mellenbruch is 100 years old at this time of the interview. She started to kindergarten in Taylor in 1922, 2 years before we became the Taylor Ducks, and she graduated from Taylor High School at the 7th Street campus. She went on to be a foreign language teacher teaching Spanish, English, and German. Her high level of expertise led to a number of leadership roles at the local, regional, and state levels. She has received a number of awards, including Austin ISD Teacher of the Year, and she was in the top 10 for Texas State Teacher of the Year. She has remained a proud Taylor Duck, and all through those years, she talks about Taylor often. It just goes to show, once a duck, always a duck. And now it's time to meet Duck Hall of Fame member Julia Clattenhoff Mellenbruch.
Julia, I am just so delighted to be able to sit down with you this afternoon and talk a little bit about your life and certainly your many accomplishments, and just to congratulate you again on being inducted into the Taylor High School Duck Hall of Fame. And I suppose we need to start way back at the beginning, so it's your turn. Tell me about your beginnings, your early beginnings.
Okay. Well, as far as Taylor is concerned, my great-grandparents moved to Taylor in the 1890s.
Wow.
Their daughter was married to a Mr. Rush, and he died, and she had 6 children, small children. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they left their farm in Pflugerville and moved to Taylor. Well, they lived long enough to have a 50th wedding anniversary. And this is what my mother told me. She was 11 years old, and their family received one of these printed invitations to this 50th wedding anniversary. And she said it was a gala affair. Mm-hmm. And everybody had a good time.
Oh, how wonderful.
So that was in 1902, of
Mm-hmm.
course.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives you a little background.
Okay.
Well, now this daughter's name was Anna, and she was the one who was married to the Rush. Well, Anna had 2 daughters that became nurses, and one of them was, well, both of these 2, like I said, they were nurses, and one of them was in charge of the nurses at the Wedemeyer Hospital.
Oh, my goodness.
And I remember things about that. And the other one was a nurse at the hospital. Well, I have very nice memories of Aunt Anna. When my family would be ill in Pflugerville, some of them came to the Wedemeyer Hospital. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather Clattenhoff, he was the one that was the immigrant that married the Pfluger. And he would be in the hospital there. He liked Mr. Wedemeyer, Dr. Wedemeyer. And sometimes they would take me in when I would be visiting with them, and they would tell me that somebody would come around soon and ask me if I wanted my name in the pot.
In the pot?
And that meant that they were expecting me to stay for lunch.
Oh.
This gives you some idea of what that Wedemeyer Hospital was. And my grandfather died in that hospital later. And fortunately, I got to spend the Christmas holidays with him because I was a teacher at that time. And it was during the holidays, and he was ill already, and he didn't die until May. But I got to spend those holidays with him there in the hospital. And I got that message, did I want my name in the pot?
In the pot. Well, so you knew if your name was in the pot, then you could stay for lunch, which was, well, what about your early days, your earliest recollections?
I lived on the farm. And in Pflugerville. I was born in this home on the farm. And a mile from where I was born, where my grandparents lived. And my grandfather decided that I was the oldest grandchild, and he was retired, and he wanted to teach me German. So as I was learning to speak, I learned German from my grandfather and English from my parents.
And that was pretty common with a lot of children at that time. Yes, all right.
And so then when we moved to Taylor in 1920, right was after World War I, and you remember that there was, well, you don't remember because you weren't living.
Not quite.
But anyway, after World War I, the Ku Klux Klan became very popular in that area.
Yes, yes.
And so as we had moved into Taylor, my mother said to me, what she was reading in the paper, it was kind of dangerous to speak German, and I was not to speak German outside the home. I could speak with Grandpa, but not outside the home.
And then that was at the time that you attended the kindergarten in?
Yeah, well, that was, I moved in 1920, and I went to kindergarten in 1922, 22 to 23.
Okay.
Yes, and my dad, in the meantime, we had moved to Taylor because he was tired of farming, and he had had a business education at Blinn College, and that was down in Brenham, Texas. And so he decided to work for an oil company there. And then when that didn't pan out too well, he started working for F.C. Bishop Land Company. Well, this was an important thing because Mr. Bishop was very interested in getting Central Texans to help develop a little community that was called Bishop. Well, my dad and my dad's uncle had worked for him during that time, and then he had died. And so my dad worked for F.C. Bishop then, and they were going to develop this little community near Cotulla, Texas.
Okay.
And so that was where we moved in 1923.
In 23.
Yeah.
But you had attended kindergarten in...
Oh, yeah, I mustn't forget that. That was very important.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about what you remember about the school and where it was. And
well, it was located right across from the old high school.
Which is the old high school.
That's
now.
right.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, my uncle, G.W. Bowles, had moved to Austin in 1922, and his daughter was attending that high school. And so I always looked forward to seeing her because she would come across the street when we were out having play in the outside, and she was going to the home economics lab, which was in the same building that we were in.
That's a kindergarten.
Yes.
So we're talking about the building that was across from the high school
Yes.
currently on 7th Street.
Yes. It
And
was
that two-story building,
catty-corner.
were you in that two-story building or were you
No, this is a one-story building.
across
I mean,
from that two-story building?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. It was kind of catty-cornered like that. Well, anyway, for our activities, we did a lot of artwork. And we had things to play with, you know, different, I can't remember exactly what all the things were, but my mother saved a lot of the artwork that I had. And so later, it was funny because I always wrote my name backward. I don't know why.
That's interesting, very interesting.
And see, I was 6 years old at that time because you started school when you were 7.
But you were also proficient in German, and
Yeah,
you could read it
yeah.
and write it.
I could, by that time, I could read it, yes, in the old script. I learned the old script. Can't read it anymore.
Well, that's a lost art, really, reading
But
that old script.
anyway, at the end of the year, we had a program.
Graduation?
Well, it was
Sort of.
the two teachers had developed this wonderful program, and everybody participated, and we had to have costumes.
Oh, my goodness.
And so my mother had to make me a costume. And
Do you remember your costume?
I know it was navy blue, and it was some kind of, but it was material. It wasn't paper, because they made a lot of paper ones too. But anyway, but it was, and my grandparents came, and oh, that was such a wonderful thing. But I have to tell you one other thing about that school. My dad always left me at the school, and he would go to his office, which was downtown on the second floor above the drugstore. You can kind of imagine that, okay. Well, one day he left me at the school like he always did, and nobody came to the school.
Okay.
And I didn't know what was happening. I was scared because I didn't know how I was going to get home or anything. And, well, but I said, I can get to Howard Street, and we live on Thompson Avenue. And I know when I get to the area where Thompson Avenue is, I'll be okay. Well, I started out, and I got to Howard Street, and lo and behold, my teacher came along in her car, and she saw me there, and she said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well, it's a holiday."
Oh.
And so she took me home.
She took you home.
Yes.
All right.
But I mean, little things like that happened. And
So you all had your father had a vehicle. I mean, you.
yeah. He had a car. He had a Model T Ford
Model T
car.
Ford. All right.
And my teacher had a real fancy car, and oh, I was scared to death almost to get in that car. And
What were you? Do you remember what the streets were like back then? Were they paved? Were they?
they were paved.
They were paved.
Yeah. These streets were not all the streets in Taylor were paved.
No. No.
But Howard Street was one of the major. Well, while I'm talking about Howard, I have to tell you, when we first moved to Taylor, the first thing they told me was my job, and that was to get the milk.
To get the milk. Okay.
Well, I had to cross Howard Street. I think it was McLean, if I'm not mistaken.
There's McLean near Howard.
Yeah, and at the McLean home, they had cows. This is in the town. They had cows. And there were 2 sons in the family, and they were renting this house. And I was given a pail that had a handle on it. It was a quart size, had a handle on it, and also a lid. And I was told in the morning I was to go and get the milk.
Did you have to get it out of the cow?
No, I didn't, because at that time I didn't know how to milk. But anyway, that was, I would go over there, and it was the Falkenbergs that were renting that place, and they had 2 boys. And Mrs. Falkenberg would say, well, now, they aren't quite through yet, and she would seat me at a table with some clabber and put a little sugar on it.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's how. This gives you some idea
Oh, yes.
of
And
what life was like.
Oh, yes, yes. Because when you first said to get the milk, I thought maybe you meant you were going to the front door, you know, after milk was delivered by the milkman. But you were even prior to that. You went straight to the cow.
Yeah.
So,
But we did have a delivery that came to the house. We had an ice box.
yes, yes.
And so then that's when they put that sign out on the window. Well, another thing about kindergarten, though, I told my grandmother when she came to visit, she says, you know, I learned something. You always want to put coffee in my milk. My teacher said, don't put coffee in the child's milk because that will make her heart beat.
Oh, that was interesting. So then tell me about, then you left Taylor.
We moved down to Los Angeles. And there were 2 first grades in my class, and that was in the East Side School. I've forgotten what it was called now. But when I got to Los Angeles, there was a little 2-room school, because this was new. Everything was new there. And so I was in the 1st grade. And my teacher was Miss Hately.
Miss Hately, Miss Hately. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
But everything took place in that little schoolhouse. We didn't have a church, but everybody came to church. In the older students' room, there were 2 rooms, you see, and of course I was in the 1st grade, and I was in one, and so they had to sit in the desks of the school children to have Sunday school and church.
Oh, that's interesting.
And we had a lot of preachers that came to serve us there, and there was no official organization at all. But my mother soon became treasurer of the church, and she ordered whatever materials they did from so that they could have Sunday school and things like that. But not only that, when Christmas came, we had the big Christmas tree there, and we handed out these little paper sacks of gifts, and an orange and an apple. And nuts and candies. And everybody got one, and everybody in the community came. And some of them didn't have Christmas trees in their homes, and so they brought their gifts, and they were delivered there.
Oh.
And my mother was really interested in helping some of the people, some of the men who were single. And so she made her usual Christmas goodies, and she would have a box for each one of them. Well, my dad owned the grocery store. And so in those days, my mother had to milk the cow because he had to be at that grocery store.
Absolutely.
And, well, it was more than groceries. It was really all
Sort of
kinds
dry
of,
goods
yeah,
and what have you.
everything. Even women's hats were on something that
A
you
lot
could,
cheaper back then, probably, than now.
and shoes and everything. But anyway, he had someone else that was with him. But since he had had all that business experience, he took care of the books, and he was also the postmaster.
Oh, my goodness. One-man community almost.
Yeah, it was. But we would have little plays and things, and my mother was making the costumes again, and she played the piano. And she wanted to have a piano so badly. Well, my Uncle G.W., who was the one who lived in Taylor, he was her oldest brother, was in charge of the estate. of that that Bowles, and so he was selling off all the assets, and Mother got a check, and she says, "I can now buy a piano."
Oh, how wonderful.
And there was well, it was called, now I have to think now, Harris Valley. It was an area where they were raising vegetables and sending them to New York on the train, because we were right on the train track. It wasn't quite enough money to buy the piano of this couple that was leaving that place. They were going back to New York. And so my mother's part wasn't quite enough to buy that piano. So on the farm, we had an Edison. That was to play discs, you know. Well, anyway, we had that, and she said her sister was a nurse at Scott and White, and she says, you know, she could use that record player, that Edison, and she could give me her money, and then I could buy the piano. Well, it was a baby grand.
Wow.
It was a nice piano. And of course, we didn't have very much money in that little store that my dad had. I saw the books once, and the most that they ever took in was $3,000 in a year.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, you know what it was like.
Yeah.
And everything. So, but that piano was a wonderful thing. But as long as my dad was in the store, during the 20s, he would send, I mean, he didn't send, he had a lady come from Cotulla, and that was 18 miles through the ranches.
A lot longer than 18 miles nowadays.
Yeah. And she had my two sisters and I, and another girl in the community as students. And so I have a copy of one of the piano recitals that was held in Cotulla, and I was playing Losa Blätter, Flying Leaves. It was a very fancy thing, and I had really worked hard to memorize all of that.
Do you still play?
Well,
piano?
I don't anymore because my fingers don't allow it.
No, wow.
But anyway.
It's amazing, though, sometimes to look at a piece and think, oh, I played that once.
But, you know, we have a copy of that particular thing. And,
Well, how wonderful.
But, you know, the school things were really fun.
School was fun.
Because we played outside twice. We had 2 recesses. And during those early years, when we were in that little 2-room school, we played with marbles, and we had hopscotch, and we threw the ball over the house. And
Probably played jacks. Did you play jacks?
Oh, yes, we played jacks. And my dad kept those things in the store, so they had a place to buy them. And
Oh, that is fun.
But we also learned to play baseball.
Oh, yes.
But we made the ball with string. And then we had a grubbing hoe handle for a bat.
Oh, how wonderful. Well, yeah,
Well,
a grubbing hoe would work, wouldn't it?
Yeah, as we got along into the 4th and 5th grade, we wanted that sort of thing. Well, then we finally got a softball.
Okay.
And we had to learn the rules for that. But that was after we moved to the building. They finally built a larger school, and it had 4 rooms, but they never had but 3 teachers.
4 rooms and 3 teachers. And how many grades?
And that was through 10th grades.
10th grade, okay. So that kind of brings us to, then you had to
had to go somewhere else. There's one other thing I wanted to mention to that. On Sunday nights, we always had singing. Now you can see why, because there was nothing else to do. Saturday nights, when we got old enough, we had little dances in the local place there, and Sundays we had singing.
Did you have electricity always, or were you
No.
prior to electricity?
Well, I'll tell you what happened on the farm where I was born. There was no utilities. When we moved to Taylor, my mother was thrilled to death because we had running water and electricity. When we moved to Los Angeles, we had running water but no electricity. But we used gasoline lanterns.
Yes, 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 yes. Did she cook on a gasoline stove?
No, she had we called it a coal oil stove.
Okay, wood burning, I mean, that type?
Yeah, at that time we called it coal oil. I don't
Isn't
know.
it amazing what they could produce under those means, really? Some of the best food I've ever eaten in my lifetime, you know?
Well, Mother had always said she was not going to cook on a wood stove, and so we moved that coal oil stove from the farm to Taylor, and then to Los Angeles.
To Los Angeles.
And when things were hard, she would use that oven and have baked potatoes and cook her homemade bread and everything all at one time in that oven.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
to save on the amount of coal oil that you
So you've actually used an outhouse.
Yes. Well, and that was when I left there. It was still the only thing that my mother had. But we did spend in the summer of 1925. My mother had to go to New Orleans to have surgery, and we did spend quite a bit of time in Taylor with the Bowleses. And so, I mean, I had that
Connection,
was a very important time in my life, you see. And I was nearly 9 years old, and I was in charge of my sister's clothes and everything. And
Yeah, one was always in charge of another, it seemed, during those
and that's
days.
the way. But Aunt Bertha and Uncle GW were very good to me and to my sisters, so that was good. But anyway, the time came, and in 1932, where we were in the worst depression you can ever imagine. And of course, we had to find out how I was going to get my degree. Not my degree, but my
Diploma.
diploma. And Lucille, the Bowles' daughter, married that summer.
Is that the one that you remember from kindergarten?
No, well, no, yeah, she's the same one.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
and so, you know, I had gotten her well acquainted with her when they lived in Taylor. It was just that 1 year.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she was the same one, and she was getting married. And Mother told my uncle, that was her oldest brother, as I said, that they didn't know what they were going to do because there was no 11th grade. And I couldn't go to Cotulla to school. I'd had a room over there because 18 miles, and we only had one car.
Right.
And so my uncle said, well, what we can do is Judah can come live with us, and she can take Lucille's bedroom. So that's how I got to Taylor in 1932.
And you started at Taylor High School then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I walked into that building, and here was this library. I had never seen a library. Oh, I was so excited because I love to read. And I knew. And then Freddie was also, their youngest son, was in the same grade that I was, so he was always helping me with things. And he helped me with my schedule. I told him that I really thought I needed to take home economics because I didn't know much about, I knew how my mother ran a home, but I didn't know very much about anything. I said, you know, I didn't know there was such a thing as a salad fork. I'd never seen one. and so he said, well, you can go ahead and take that. Now, what else would you like to take? And I said, well, I have to have senior English, and I've never had, in my English class, any literature. It's always been how to parse a sentence and diagram, and it was all, I really almost memorized that little booklet that we had.
You had that little plain English booklet, I bet. Walsh's plain English book. I think I still have one of those somewhere.
Okay. And so I had to have senior English, and one semester was grammar, but the other semester was literature. And I had started my Spanish, and so I had a wonderful Spanish teacher.
Tell me about her.
Oh, Lilis Lewis was her name. Did you ever know her?
No, I think she was a little bit, she was already gone by the time that.
But she had married a Taylor man and had left Taylor. But anyway, she was a wonderful teacher. And then the business department really interested me. And he said, what courses do you want to take? And I said, well, I want to take bookkeeping, because my dad was a bookkeeper, and I had worked in the gin several summers with him. And when he sold his store, he took over the gin, and he had me weighing cotton and stuff like that.
So you've actually weighed cotton?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And well, I was weighed the cotton.
You didn't grade it. You didn't grade the cotton.
No.
No.
But I did pick cotton. Yeah. And when we weren't doing something else, we were picking cotton. That Mother saw to it that we always did everything.
You did everything.
Yeah, we never had a lot of playing time when we were. But so bookkeeping was going. Then I said salesmanship. My mother always made me sell something. I could go around to the people in the community and sell greeting cards. Or I could stand on the corner in front of Dad's store and sell magazines.
Okay.
And so I said, I'd like to take a course in salesmanship. Well, at this time, Leon was taking a business course.
Now, Leon was
Freddie's brother, older brother. He was at UT. And so they all helped me to get this together. And so I used everything that I learned in that. I had the most wonderful teachers.
Do you remember you mentioned Miss Lewis, right?
Yes.
The Spanish teacher. Do you remember, what was your English teacher's name? You remember?
You know, I cannot remember. I remember
Beck?
her.
Could it have been?
But I cannot remember her name.
I bet you could probably still quote some poetry from her class.
Oh, listen, one out of Presley poet. One out of Presley, let me see, one out of Presley sure sota, the Dora Martyr Percy to the Rota, and Bath the Devon Vein Swish liquor, of which the tea engendered is the floor. I mean,
pretty amazing. She is somewhere saying, "Good girl."
That's old English.
Good girl.
But anyway, she was a wonderful teacher.
Okay. Was Miss Dolan your?
Oh yeah, Miss Dolan was the Spanish teacher.
No, Miss.
No, wait. I mean, she was a
bookkeeping.
Bookkeeper. Yeah.
Bookkeeping. Now she was still. When I graduated from high school in 1954, Bessie Dolan was still teaching and doing an excellent job. She was still,
I'm glad.
Yeah, she was still there. And she was great bookkeeping and salesmanship.
Well, you know, it was a 2-hour class at that time. And I think that I don't know how I would have gotten along in life later if I hadn't had that bookkeeping class.
Yeah. Where did the Bowles live at that time?
But they lived on McLean. They were still living on McLean Street.
So how far was that? Did you walk to school or did you?
Well, sometimes my uncle would take us, but it was about a mile. and other times we walked. And I didn't come home for lunch.
Okay.
I took an apple or some piece of fruit, and Lillis Lewis knew that I had a good background already for my Spanish, and she said, would I help her grade the papers for the first year class? And I said I would glad to do that during the lunch hour because I was not going home. That was a walk that far and then walk back. Yeah, it was about a mile. And so that's what I did. And
they did have lunches in the cafeteria, though, correct? I mean,
Yeah.
there were lunches, but they cost, obviously.
But one time they gave me a nickel and I bought a bowl of soup.
All right.
They were going to be out of town, and so they gave me a nickel.
A nickel for a bowl of soup?
And that's the only time I ever ate in that cafeteria. But we had the most wonderful programs in the auditorium. I guess I'm trying to think. It was a regular auditorium because I know we had our graduation exercise in that auditorium.
You graduated in 32, so that would have
I know,
been
33.
33, so that would have been the school on 7th Street then. Okay.
Yeah, that was.
In the auditorium there. Okay.
So that was really good. Well, there's so many things I can.
What else do you remember about your senior year?
But in my
what did you
senior-
participate in, or what could you participate in?
You know, I had a really good PE teacher, and I liked sports. And so I was able to play tennis and volleyball that year after school in the afternoons. We didn't have any competition with other schools. It was just all within our school. But that was one thing I did.
Do you remember who the coaches were back then? Like
I cannot
the
remember
boys?
her name at all.
I think superintendent back then was probably Mr. Brister.
Yeah, he was. Mr. Brister was the superintendent. Freddie was always thinking about things that he could do. My Aunt Bertha said there'll be no dating.
Oh.
And
That was Freddie's mother.
Yeah, Freddie's mother.
No dating for
No dating
you
for me
or for
that
Freddie?
year when I was with Liz. Well, okay.
Well, she didn't want that responsibility, probably.
No. Anyway, I didn't care because I loved to read. But anyway, Freddie played football, and he also played basketball. And it was so funny. The day that he got his sweater for playing football, you know, all the seniors that were...
Yeah, they had sweaters
They
back
had
then.
sweaters. And here these boys were going to their girlfriends to give them the sweater. He brought me his sweater.
Oh, how neat.
Well, the other thing that I thought was so wonderful is they were going to have the junior-senior banquet. There was no way I was going to have a formal. Everybody was wearing a formal. Well, Lillis Lewis said...
This is the Spanish teacher.
Yeah, the Spanish teacher. She said, you know, I went to Europe last summer, and on the boat, we had to dress every evening. And I have several evening dresses, and I bet you could wear one of those.
Oh, how...
She gave me that dress to wear, and I went to the banquet with Freddie.
Oh.
Freddie's girlfriend had graduated the year before.
Okay, so you weren't stealing another.
No,
okay.
no. And the other thing is...
And where was the prom? Do you remember?
It was, I'm sure...
Probably in the gym or in the cafeteria.
Gym. Yeah. No, I'm sure it was in the cafeteria, yeah.
Okay.
But remember, this was they didn't have any money. This was, but the,
This was still the Depression, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted, this is one thing I didn't mention. You know, FDR was inaugurated in 1933 in January. The next day, the banks were closed. My uncle had 25 cents in his pocket. It was a scary day.
It was a scary day.
But everything worked out well in Taylor because the banks were able to open again. But a lot of places where the farmers had borrowed a lot of money, they didn't open. was really sad. Well, back to the other things that he did for me was, like I said, to take me to the junior senior banquet. But he also was going to play in the senior play. There was a very minor part. He told the coach that he would bring me to the practice. She wouldn't have to try to get somebody else if she would let me take that part in the senior play. So I got to be in the senior play.
How wonderful.
Could you ask for any more?
No, not really. And Freddie had a leading role?
Yeah, he did in the play. And so,
how wonderful.
And do you know that when I came to the university as a junior, University of Texas, and he was there, he had been there for 2 years already, and he helped me find a job because I had to have a job. I mean, he kept up with my career because he knew what I wanted to do was to be a language teacher. And so he kept up with my all of that. Every time I had
So he became a mentor to you.
He was.
How wonderful.
But the reason I was able to get that job was I had gone to the cafeteria, and I said in junior college I had worked in the cafeteria, and they had paid me $5 a month, but everybody had to have a job.
Now that was the junior college.
It was Texas Lutheran in Seguin.
Okay, which is now Texas Lutheran University, but TLC at that time. And this was still part of that era of the Depression where everybody...
Oh, it was terrible. But my mother had saved enough money in the bank in Round Rock from a farm that her father had given her. I mean, it was an inheritance thing. And she had been saving the money in that, and nobody was to touch it. And as a result, we didn't even know she had all that money, which was about $500.
Oh, wow, wow, wow.
And I had to pay $250 each year for
at TLC.
That's room board and tuition. And
and you had a job also.
But and I worked in the cafeteria, and so they gave me $5 a month extra. That was my spending money.
Yeah. $5 went a lot farther then than it does now.
Yes. But anyway, to get this job, FDR was trying to help youth, and he started this National Youth Administration. Of course, I'm sure Congress was the ones that allowed it. And it started that year, 35. Now
this is by the time you're at UT.
At UT.
Okay.
And so I thought, well, I worked in the cafeteria at TLC, and why don't I just go to the cafeteria? Because they had that wonderful cafeteria on campus. That's where we ate.
Right.
And I talked to the lady in charge, and she was very much interested. And then she said, I want to know what your major is. And I said, Spanish. She said, I'm sorry. All of my help is in home economics. I don't hire anybody that's not in home economics.
Oh, goodness.
So that was it. Well, fortunately, I was out on the campus and I met Freddie. It just happened.
Appeared.
Yeah. And he said, you know, there's a new program that's just started. And LBJ is in charge of it for the state of Texas. And the university worked hard, but they got enough going to start this program. Well, they also had other kinds of work. You could work on roads, and that's when they started building those roadside parks. That was part of that program. But for the universities, students in the university, they said that they would allow professors to have aides. And so I told her, I told the lady that was interviewing me that that was my, I told her that also because the lady in the cafeteria said no, nothing. No. Okay. Well, anyway, and when I walked in, she said, "That's a mighty pretty dress you have on." I said, "Yes, my mother made it." And I remember it was blue, dark blue dotted Swiss.
Oh.
You know, you remember things
Isn't
like
that amazing? What you do remember, what you forget.
And then I told her, you know what, I didn't get a job, and I really needed a job because I'd worked in the summer and I had enough money to kind of help me, but I needed another job. So she said, "Well, what is your major?" And I told her it was Spanish. She said, "Oh, we have a government professor that's looking for somebody Spanish." She sent me over to visit him, and he said, "Fine." He took me.
So you had your job.
I had my job. And you know what they paid?
I would have to, well, I worked in college in 1954 for 75 cents an hour, minimum wage.
Well, we got 20 cents an hour.
20 cents, 20 cents, wow.
Well, my roommate and I figured out how we could make our meals on 40 cents a day by eating in the cafeteria there. We had our breakfast in a drugstore, and it was always something sweet and a cup of coffee. That's all. And then
that was probably what, about 10 cents or?
Yeah, it was 10 cents.
10 cents.
And so the other 30 cents was between those two.
The other two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you see, a dish that was round was 5 cents. A dish that was oblong was 3. So we would decide what we were going to eat, and we would take half of the round one, each one take half, and we took the whole part of the other. So you see, we could always have something that we really wanted, and then we could share.
Well, that was pretty smart thinking right
and
there.
That's how we did it.
Oh, that is amazing. That's amazing. So then you graduated from UT, and
yeah. But you know, I had a hard year that year. I was doing my student teaching.
This was in
1937.
37, okay.
In February of 37, my sister, who was just younger than me, had pneumonia, and it settled in her chest cavity, and they took her to San Antonio to the hospital, Santa Rosa Hospital, and she almost died.
Oh, goodness.
And my mother stayed with her, and she was there for 2 months. And I would go on weekends, but I couldn't go until after I'd finished my classes on Saturday. And then I would take the bus to San Antonio and spend one night with my sister so my mother could go and stay with friends for that one night.
Well, and then you'd have to come back.
And then I had to come back. Well, in May, no, I guess it was the last week in April, it was right after Easter, we finally had gotten my sister to be able to live with these friends of theirs there. And, but Mother got pneumonia.
Oh.
And she died.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
In 2 weeks, she died. Well, I spent 1 week with her. Well, and I had gotten the message to the person who was my the director of my teaching experience. You know what? Well, anyway, she got in touch with all my professors and told them what the situation was, why I was having this problem. But I only missed 1 week of school, and then but anyway, that's just what happened.
Right.
But the thing that is just still so important is the fact that I had used up all my money. One time I'd even had to walk because I didn't have the nickel to ride the streetcar to the hospital. And so, but I was going to have about $25 for expenses for graduation. And I happened to meet Freddie.
Oh, Freddie.
And I told him that my teacher had, my professor had told me that I could go over to the Ex-Students Association and probably get a loan for the $25. Well, Freddie said, "You don't need to do that." He said, "I've had a job now for all these years in the physics department," and he said, "I have one of those, it wasn't a check because the state didn't have any money. It was, well, I've forgotten what they called them, something. Anyway, he says, I have one for $25. So the first thing I did when I started teaching was to pay back Freddie. He refused to take the check.
Oh. Well, I'm sure he feels that he has had a direct influence on you and everything that you were to become. So, but that is a wonderful story. So then tell me, so then you started teaching?
I had to get a job right away. Well, and you know, it was hard to get jobs in 37. But we had a friend his wife had lived with my folks while she was teaching at Los Angeles.
And that was common for teachers back then, too.
But anyway, he was superintendent of a small school near Three Rivers. And he found out I was graduating, and he came to see me and offered me a job. Well, I thought I was going to have to go home and live with my dad and my sisters, you know, because they each lacked a year to graduate. And my dad said, "No way, yes, you take that job." And of course, I helped him with that $90 a month pay off some of his bills that he owed.
You're talking about your dad.
Yeah, my
you
dad.
Helped your dad, yes.
I mean, because things were just so bad.
Right. Somewhere along here, you met a young man, didn't you? I mean,
Yeah, well, I had...
They always come around.
Yeah, well, I had a boyfriend
okay.
that at TLC, and he didn't go to UT.
Okay.
But I dated him for a while. And then, this is a long, I can't tell this whole story, but anyway.
Well, try me.
Anytime. My Aunt Annie, who was the one who was in the hospital in Temple, you know, it's like out in White, was a very good friend of my husband's sister.
Okay. Your husband-to-be.
Yeah, my husband-to-be. I didn't know him.
You didn't know him.
No.
Okay.
But as a result, we knew this lady very well because Aunt Annie never married, and she, my sister was her best friend, you know, in life, really. And so we learned to know Olive, and that was real good. Well, the day after I graduated
from UT?
From UT, we were on our way home down to Los Angeles. And my dad said, "You know, I've had so much trouble with this car, and Mr. Herbert in San Antonio is really good, and we'll just stop there and let him look at the car." Well, we did. And Mr. Herbert was Olive's husband.
Okay.
And there was a man working with me, and he was Mellenbruch. And he was I mean, I told him, and he was working in this service station in the summertime because he had told his brother who was getting married, he said, if I have a new car, and if you'll take my mother on your honeymoon to California so she can visit with her sister, I'll let you use my car and I'll work in the service station for you while you're gone.
Okay.
Well, while we were sitting there waiting because for the car to be fixed, we carried on a conversation when he was free, and he said something about he was going to be teaching in Three Rivers this next year. He had been there for 2 years, no, I guess 3 years before. Anyway, he was older than me, and
So it's an older man.
yeah. So anyway, I said, well, I'm going to be teaching in Callahan. He said, well, that's only 15 miles. And 15
miles was less then, by then.
and it was in a place where there was no paved highway. But anyway, he said, I may see you sometime. Blah. That was it. And we hadn't been in Callahan very long, my roommate and I, until he was bringing over some of his football students. He was also the coach besides teaching Spanish, and he'd grown up in the valley. He knew Spanish. But anyway, so he had brought them over to the prize fight that was going on in one of the gyms there.
Oh my goodness. So they had prize fights that
in those days. And so he found out where I was staying, and he took his my roommate and me for a little ride, because we didn't have cars.
No. Now this was what year then? About 19?
That was 37.
37. Okay.
Yeah, and so through that year, he first started taking both of us to the movies in Three Rivers, and then one weekend, my roommate went to San Antonio for the weekend. That's where she lived. And as a result, he took me. And from then on,
he took you.
Yeah.
Oh.
And that was that.
And that was that. And so you were married when?
In 39.
In 39.
Yeah.
And then you started teaching, I guess, wherever you could get a job. I mean, but
I couldn't.
Or did
teach.
you have to follow him? Or
I had to go with him, and he was teaching at a small college.
And he was coaching?
And coaching.
Okay.
Out of Waco, a small college out of Waco. And I went everywhere trying to find a job, and they said, as long as there's one person in the family, we cannot hire you, not even in the drugstore. I said, you know, I worked in a drugstore one summer. They said, Kate, do it. And so I took courses in this college that I hadn't taken before. And I was playing the piano then, and there was a piano available at this college. And my husband was dean of men, and so we had to live in the men's dormitory.
Oh, so he was actually at a college level then?
Yes.
Oh, and you lived in the dormitory. Okay.
Men's dormitory. Well, we stayed there only 1 year because they were having trouble with that college, and it was going, you know, they just couldn't pay us anymore. And you know, $90 a month is what we got, but we got our room and board.
Right. I remember you were telling me before about a job that you had during wartime.
Yeah, that's what I was going to tell you. But then when school was out, I found out that Spanish and German teachers were getting jobs with the federal government as censors.
That's amazing. Tell me a little bit about that. I mean, what were you censoring?
We were censoring mail.
I see.
And I started out in San Antonio, and I was doing magazines and newspapers and things like that. I was in that section. I wasn't reading mail.
The magazines were from?
They were from Latin American countries.
I see.
Because there were a lot of Germans that owned businesses in the Central American countries, and some in Mexico also. Okay. And they wanted to know what was going on down there. It was very important that we...
For security.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So that was, and I stayed with that. Well, then Glenn had to move to the Valley. He was teaching in San Antonio, loved it, and they were having trouble getting help in the citrus groves. And his brother was ill, and he couldn't get help anymore. And he said, Glenn, you've got to come and help me. And so he gave up his job, and he went down there to help his brother in the citrus industry. Well, I stayed in San Antonio. Okay. And then finally I got a move to Brownsville, and took my son with me to Brownsville, and he stayed in the Catholic nursery during the time that I was working, and everything worked out okay. And finally, they moved me closer to home, to San Juan, where we lived, and I finished out the war there.
Okay. And then at some point, I assume you came back to Austin?
We said, what we'll do is get our master's degrees at UT.
Oh,
and then we came to Austin.
And that was about what year then?
53.
53, okay, all right. So you came back to Austin, and then you've been here ever since?
I've been here ever since.
Ah,
but and the interesting things that we did in between were I had a Fulbright to study in Columbia.
Really?
One summer.
Wow.
And then my husband decided everybody else was going out, the professors and all, they were all going out and to other places, and so he said, well, he'd like to go, and so he got a job, which turned out to be in Brazil, and I was teaching Spanish at Austin High at the time, and he said, don't you want to go with me? Well, I mean, it was one of those things where I wouldn't have a job, but I could teach English in Brazil. So that's what we did. And he got the job, and I went along, and some days I taught all day long because we had wonderful materials in the government for teaching English. And that was something that they had really worked on, and so we had wonderful materials. And I had people like doctors, lawyers, professors that wanted to learn English. Isn't that something?
Isn't that amazing? You know, people always want to learn English, but yet we don't always try to learn other languages. Yeah. But oh, and that was, what year was this now?
Now that was 61.
61, okay.
I guess it was 62 when we went down there. Yeah, we went in 62 and 64. That's what it was, 62 to 64.
So you were there 2 years?
Yes.
And then came back to Austin?
And then came back to my job in Austin.
With Austin AISD. So actually you were, in your jobs with Austin AISD, you were primarily, I mean, tell me your accomplishments there.
Well,
I know there are many.
Well, you know, I was always involved in the organizations, and one of them was the State Foreign Language Teachers Association, and I was the vice president and president of that. And I also...
Of the foreign language?
Of the foreign language.
Department in Austin.
And then in 1972, they decided to have a specialist in foreign languages, and I was hired for that for the last 7 years of my career. And so I was coordinator for foreign languages.
Some of the other things that you did, such as I know that You were a docent at the
LBJ Library for 29 years.
for 29 years.
After I retired.
After you retired for 29 years, you were a docent.
And
So you must have amassed thousands of hours there.
but you see, I only went one day a week.
Well, that's still quite an accomplishment to go one day a week for 29 years. My goodness.
Well, another interesting thing that I did was to teach Spanish to seniors. They had an
You mean seniors as in seniors?
Yeah, seniors.
Okay.
To teach seniors. And I did that.
In a lifetime learning one of the lifetime learning situations?
That's right.
Okay.
And I would have 2 classes on Wednesday. My husband was ill and he had surgery, and so I got a lady to come on Wednesdays and stay at the house. And then besides that, the other things, the Pfluger family had asked me to take over the genealogy. And so I did that. And I started somewhere in the 70s. And finally, Kent is Leon's son. Okay, and Kent took over.
Oh, Kent has taken over the genealogy?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's in good hands then.
I had published 2 books, and he published a third. And I think he's going to do something on the Bowles family. This was all Pfluger.
Do you remember what your first teaching salary was?
Yeah, it was $90 a month, $810 a year.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
I mean, to think of a beginning teacher today, I mean, they can't even understand the concept there. I remember being so excited when my take-home salary was $300. I was ecstatic. I thought, and then I had a friend who said, I'd never been so rich to be so poor. And looking back on Taylor High School, what things do you remember the most? I know you remember walking in that library.
Yes, but I remember all of the experiences that I had with Lillis Lewis. She did so many interesting things with her. And of course, I just loved doing all those things with Dolan. Oh, and I love my English teacher.
Yes, and you still can recite that poetry, believe me. Now, I know that going into that library that you enjoyed reading, and you probably read a lot because your aunt wouldn't let you date, but evidently you had a pretty good time anyway. I'm not worried about you there. But so you read about lots of places, and I think you actually, and I know you said you spent time in Brazil, but you've also traveled extensively.
Yeah, I traveled to all of every continent except Antarctica.
Oh my goodness.
The only thing I did in Africa was Kenya. And I took 2 of my grandsons and my daughter.
And didn't you and your husband sponsor some trips?
Oh, yeah. Well, I did a lot of trip sponsoring.
Okay.
With our church and everything. I love to sponsor trips.
Okay. All right. Okay.
But the retired teachers at that time had a young teacher that decided to do trips. And he was the one that helped us get those trips that were reasonable for teachers.
And that's wonderful, really.
And that's where we had a lot of opportunities.
And I think somebody, well, I think it was Nancy Pfluger Payne, a friend of mine, who told me that you actually have a map or something that you...
Oh, yeah, I have a map that shows all the places I've been.
Okay, all right. Places you've been and the things you've seen.
Yeah,
okay.
and I always say that Australia was great, but New Zealand was my favorite.
And see, that's still on my bucket list, but I'm not sure I'll make it. But
Okay.
Anyway, tell me a little bit about your family now. your children. You've mentioned them. Your daughter, Marianne,
Yeah.
and then your son. Okay, and then I assume you have some grandchildren.
Yeah, I have 4 grandsons,
Okay.
and 3 of them are married, and 1 of them is not married now. But and then I have 6 great-grandchildren, and 2 of them are already in college.
Oh my goodness.
One of them is a junior at Texas State, and one is a freshman at A&M.
Oh,
And
so
another
we're going
one-
to have an Aggie here.
Well, the funny part was my husband and I both got our bachelor's and master's degree from Texas. My daughter and son got their first degrees there. None of my grandsons got a degree from Texas.
Oh my goodness. Well.
Well, 2 of them went to A&M. When they had that Ku Klux Klan, and my mother told me I couldn't speak German outside the home, but my dad was in an office building with Dan Moody and Judge Kreitz.
Oh my
And
goodness.
they were the ones who got that Ku Klux Klan under control.
Absolutely.
And that is an important thing to remember.
Yes. Yes. Most definitely.
Yeah. And I just didn't, I mean, they didn't pay any attention to me. I was a little kid. But I paid attention to them.
That's a very, very interesting part of the history of Taylor and
Yes,
the
it is.
Klan.
Very.
Very
And you know, Dan Moody's home is
Right there.
right
yes.
there, and it is a museum.
It is. It definitely is. Weren't you named a Austin AISD Teacher of the Year?
Oh, yes, I was.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
Well, tell me about it.
But I was 10th in the state. I know when they,
You were Austin AISD Teacher of the Year.
yes,
And then also
I
one
was
of the top
one of the
10
top 10.
finalists for the state of Texas.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was trying to think what other thing.
Well, I know didn't you work at TEA? Didn't you do some things at Texas Education Agency?
I did.
Such as?
Yeah, I did some programs for them, and I also helped them with the use of the laboratory. Oh, I wrote a textbook on the use of the tape recorder in the classroom.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. On the use of the tape recorder in the class. We have come a long way, have we not?
I should have brought a list of
Well, I'm sure there is a long, long list, but anyway, it evidently has been a long and distinguished career, and you probably have influenced countless of hundreds of other language teachers. So,
well,
good job.
okay.
What an amazing person. Congratulations, Julia, on your induction into the Duck Hall of Fame. Be sure to watch for more videos in the Duck Hall of Fame series to be added soon. And remember, once a duck, always a duck.